Hello. In this tutorial we are going to be making this game in Pygame. It is a pretty straightforward shooting range game. You just click on different targets and then they disappear, and while it happens, a sound plays in the background. It's pretty straightforward overall. But the game itself isn't the really interesting part about this. The really interesting part is that we're using sprites to create all of this. And sprites in Pygame is a dedicated class that is incredibly useful. So let's talk about it. In video games, a sprite basically just means that you have a two-dimensional piece of art. Think of like Super Mario from the 90s games. And the only reason we even call them sprites and not just pictures or images is historical. That when video games first came around, to draw stuff on the screen needed a specific process. And pictures drawn in a very specific way were called sprites. And the term just stuck around, so now we just use it for basically any kind of graphic in video games. That being said, in Pygame, a sprite is something specific. It is a class that allows you to combine an image and a rectangle in a single object, and then work with it quite easily. And just a quick recap on how drawing in Pygame works. The main thing you are seeing is the display surface object. That's the thing that the user actually sees in the end, and that needs to have all the elements that you want to display. But besides this main surface, you can have other surfaces, and each surface can have individual elements. Let's say a picture or just a plain color on it. And then you can put these extra surfaces on the main display surface, which works reasonably well. But there's one major problem, that you cannot move the images by themselves. To move them, you have to put a rectangle around them, and then you move this rectangle that constrains the image. And these rectangles are called rects. And putting all of this together can be a bit of a hassle, because you have to work with lots of different pieces of code to combine the images and the rects. And the sprite basically combines all of this into one class that makes it much easier to work with. But in the process of achieving that, the sprite classes actually do quite a bit more. So for example, you could add sounds or animations to these things as well quite easily, while still remaining in the same class. So think of a sprite object not just as a thing to display an image, but more as a representation of a real object in the video game. So let's say one sprite could be a main character, and we put all our attributes for the main character in this class. So if we have a Super Mario main character, we could put all the images and animation and sounds and health all in this one sprite and have it neatly tucked away in this one category. And we wouldn't have it scattered around our code all over the place. And finally, there's one extra thing in code that is also incredibly useful, and that's groups. Essentially, you can put sprites into different groups and then tell these groups to update every single sprite in that group individually, and you can also tell the group to draw every sprite that is in the group. And why this is useful, just look at the game we have. I am drawing 50 different targets. If we draw each of them individually, it would be quite a lot of code. But with a group, you just put them all in a group and tell the group to draw every single item in it. And in this way, we do this entire thing in a single line of code. And all of this is incredibly powerful. So let's actually implement all of this. And we're going to start with a very bare bones sprite class and then build our way up from there. So here's the most minimalist Pygame setup you can get away with. We start by importing pygame and sys, then we initiate pygame, then we create a clock variable that we will later use to control the frame rate, then we create our main display surface. In my case it's called screen, and these are the dimensions. It's quite a straightforward one. Then we come to the main game loop, and we only really check if the player closes the game, and at the end of the loop, we draw whatever frame was painted. Obviously right now, since we didn't draw anything, all of this is going to be black. So if I run this, all we see is a black screen, which is a decent enough start, I suppose. And to create the simplest possible class that makes a reasonable amount of sense, let's just draw a red square on all of this, and then we work our way up from there. To start building a class, we need the class keyword, and then we need to give it a name. Since I'm later going to use this class for the crosshair, I'm just going to call it crosshair for now. But you could really call it whatever you want. And this class needs to inherit from pygame.sprite.Sprite. And be careful about what letter you capitalize, that one's quite important. And if you're completely new to Python, this tutorial is only going to make sense if you have at least a basic understanding of classes. Otherwise you will be lost quite fast. Now we need to initiate the basic attributes. And this is going to be with the dunder init method. And as always, it needs to start with self. But now we need to give this class the basic attributes we want to use to create this basic object. And in my case, since we're just going to make a block, I'm going to give this block a couple of attributes. I'm going to start with width and height. Then I'm going to give it a position X and a position Y. And make sure I don't get a typo in here. And then I'm going to give it a color. And that's all we need for now. So, double colon. And the first one we need is super. And again, the dunder init method to initiate the object we inherit from. And now we need to use all of these attributes to create an image and a rectangle around it, which we can actually do quite easily. Let's start by creating the image itself. So I'm going to call it self.image. And to create a blank image, we need pygame.surface. And this one only needs one argument. And that is going to be the height and the width of the surface. So I'm just going to put in width and height. So now we would have an empty surface. The next thing, because we just want to make a plain square, we need to fill it with a certain color. So self.image, and now we need to fill it with the color we have. So now we would be having an image, but we need to draw a rectangle around it. And that one is done, so I'm going to create a new variable called self.rect. And this one is going to be self.image.getRect. And all this one does is it takes this image, or let's say this one image, and draws an image around it. So whatever size we put in here is also going to be the size of the rectangle we get in here. And this is all we need for a basic rectangle. So now we have a class. From that we need to create an object. And I guess I'm going to keep with calling it crosshair, because we're going to reuse that in a little bit. And now we need to use the class to create the object. And now we need to give it all the attributes. So for width and height, let's say I'm going to give it 50 and 50. And I'm going to put it at coordinates 100 and 100. And for the color, as usual, we need an RGB tuple. I'm going to make mine, I guess, white, and I give it 255, 255, and 255. So now we have an object. But this object is not drawn on the main display surface. And here's one slightly annoying thing for sprites, that you can't draw them individually, they always have to be drawn in a group. So what we need to do first is create a group for the sprites and then put the crosshair object into this group, and then we tell the group to draw all of the sprites in there. So I'm going to call it our crosshair group, and to create a group, the command is pygame.sprite.Group. And again, the uppercase here matters a lot. And crosshair group.add crosshair. So we have created our group, and then we have added crosshair to this group. And we're almost done. The one thing left is that we need to tell this group to draw all the sprites in it. And this one is done with crosshair group.draw. And the only argument we need is to tell it what surface to draw on, which in our case is screen. So if I run the code now, this should be working. And it almost works. I forgot one thing, because right now we have a rectangle, but it's drawn at the top left. And what I forgot, up here, one we have called position X and position Y, but I haven't set this rectangle in a certain position. But that's very easy to do. Self.rect, and let's say we could move the center. And there are lots of points on the rect that you can move. Center is right in the middle. So this one, I guess, tends to make the most sense. And all this one needs is a tuple with position X and position Y. So now the position information actually matters. And let's try this again now. And it should be a position 100 and 100. Now we can see a distance. And I think you can already see why this kind of approach makes sense. Because right now in our game loop, all we need is this one line, and this is very neat. And anything that's in this class we can just tug away, and it happens up here. So all of this is going to make your code quite a bit cleaner. But as we go along, we're going to add more and more stuff, and you're going to see in more and more detail why having sprites really makes a lot of sense. So with that one done, let's actually build the full game around this. And before we get into this, I have to talk about a couple of other things. The first thing is that I didn't create the art myself. I used some artwork from a website called OpenGameArt, which hosts public domain art, which basically means you have some artists that work for free and create really good artwork. And there's some really amazing pieces on there. And I put a link to the assets that I have used from that website. And the other thing, where you save your folders really matters. In my case, I have one folder that contains all the pieces. So in my folder, I have the code for this game. I have a couple of pictures for the target, the crosshair, and the background. And then I have a sound file, and this has to be in the same folder. Otherwise, you would need to select the path more specifically. So let's get started with the background then. And let me organize my code just a little bit better. So we have specific groups. I'm gonna call this crosshair. And this is game screen. Yeah, this works. Okay, the first thing is I want to load an image, and this is going to be the background image. So I will create a new variable that I will call background. And to load an image into Pygame, we need pygame.image.load. And now we need the name of the background file, which in my case is called bg.png, short for background. But if we're loading this now, this would not be showing. And I can actually demonstrate this. Can't see it. The reason is, when Pygame loads a new image, it puts the new image on its own surface. So right now, we have a screen surface that the player can't see, and then we have a background surface that floats around in space right now. So we need a way to put this background image on the screen image, which we can do quite easily. The command for that is called blit. And all we need is screen.blit. So the surface we want to put stuff on, then blit. And now we need the argument of what other surface we want to put on it, which in our case is background. Oops. Background. Yeah, all works. And the second argument we need is the coordinates that we want to put it on. And here we are moving the top left of the image. So if we want to put it on the same coordinates as the original surface, we need 0 and 0. And if we do the entire thing now, this should be working. Exactly. Now we can see a background picture. So that's a good start. The next thing I would like to work on is that when you hover over this, you can see the mouse. But in my case, I only want the player to see the crosshair, which we're going to add later, but we need to hide the mouse. And that's a nice thing to start on for now, because we can hide the mouse very easily. And I'm going to keep on doing this in the main setup. And all we need is pygame.mouse.setVisible to false. And now, when I run the code again, you cannot see a mouse as long as you hover over the game. But you still have access to the mouse coordinates. So even though you can't see the mouse, you can still use it. So we can later use the mouse coordinates to get the position for the crosshair. Alright, now we have our basic setup. With that one done, let's work on creating the actual crosshair. And for that one, we need to reorganize our crosshair class quite a bit. The first thing we don't need width and height anymore, and we also don't need color, because we are just going to use a picture for the crosshair. Let me get rid of all of this. And then in the code, we don't fill the surface anymore, and pygame image is also not going to be needed anymore. And this one we can also get rid of, because we're going to use the mouse position for the position of the crosshair. So all of this can go for now. So the first thing we need now is that self.image needs the image of the crosshair that we're going to load from a picture. So just like with the background, we need pygame.image.load, and I called mine crosshair.png. I really cannot type today. And you could actually change this. Let me actually do that. Instead of putting a name here, we can make this a bit more flexible, and we can just call this picture path. So instead of always going for the same picture, we can get this when we actually create the object from the class. So this would give us a picture. And then we still got the rectangle around this picture. So that's a fair enough start. And let me actually get all of this. So now all we need Oh yeah, we can get rid of position X and Y as well, actually. Because we are going to do this in a slightly different way. I'm going to explain this in just a second. So all we really need is the picture path. So when we create the object, which happens here, we just need a path towards whatever the picture is called and crosshair. So if I run the game now, this should be working. Exactly. Now we have our picture of the crosshair in the top left. And obviously right now it doesn't have a position, so Pygame puts it at position 0, 0 of the top left, which is the top left part of the screen. And now let's make it follow the mouse. And this brings us to another really useful part of the sprite class, and that is the update method. So when I create update as a method in the class, this is a very specific kind of method that is predefined in the original sprite class. And why this one is special, by itself, it doesn't do anything. So you can write in here whatever you like. But why this is important is that you can give the group, besides drawing, you can also tell crosshair group dot update. And if you call this group update on the entire group, each update in each individual class of this group is going to be called every time this update is called. So that's quite an easy way to work across lots of different sprite classes and update all of them simultaneously without much hassle. And in our case, we want to update the position of this crosshair on the position of the mouse on every frame, which is really easy to do actually. All we need is self.rect.center, kind of like we have done before. But this time we're going to give it the position pygame.mouse.get pos. And all that this line does is give us the X and Y position of the mouse. And since center also takes 2 arguments, this one works perfectly. And if we run the game now, this should be working. Exactly. Now we can see our moving crosshair, which works really nicely. All right. Now let's give it a sound, and you can already see why this starts to make more sense. Because in our actual game loop, this is really easy to follow. That we draw the crosshair group, and then we make it update in every frame. And besides that, nothing else much happens in here whatsoever. And the next thing I want to add is to play a sound whenever we press the button to imitate a shooting sound. And to do that, I'm going to create a new method. I'm going to call shoot, and we need self as an argument, as always. And to make this work, we first need a sound that we want to play, which I'm going to create when we initiate the class itself up here. So self, and I'm going to call this gunshot. And to load a sound into Pygame, we need pygame.mixer.sound. And now we need the name of the file. In my case, I called it gunshot.wav. So this is the sound, and this kind of is loaded like a picture. And now, when we shoot, we just need to play the sound, which happens with self.gunshot.play. Now we have a way to play the sound in a straightforward method. And now we just need to connect this to clicking the mouse, which happens in here. Well, it happens in here. So all I want is if event.type equals pygame.mouse button down, all in capital letters. Then I want to play, I'm gonna call it crosshair, not the class itself, just the object we create, dot shoot. And if I play the game now, we should be having a sound. And I hope you can hear this, but it is definitely working. And now that we have a crosshair, we can create a new class that is going to be the class for the targets. And this one works in, well, let's say I'm going to start this in pretty much the same way as I started my crosshair class. And if you're a bit more advanced, you could totally use inheritance here to make this a bit less annoying on typing. But that would be a tutorial for another day. But should be fairly straightforward. Okay. We can... Actually, I can just copy this entire thing. That would be much faster. Okay. So now this is kind of similar to the first one, but for the targets, we don't want to move them along the mouse. We want them to put them on a certain position. So this one is just going to get self.rect.center. And I just want to put it... I have to add these pos X and pos Y. Pos X and pos Y. So how this class is different from this class is that this class doesn't get a position immediately, instead it just follows wherever the mouse is. Whereas for this class, we specify position X and position Y, and then put the center of the rectangle wherever that position happens to be. So that allows us to place all of these targets in different positions. And now we need to create lots of these targets and scatter them around the screen. And how I'm going to approach this is that I'm going to create a new group just for the targets, and use a for loop to add lots of targets to this group, and then just draw them all at the same time. So let me add a new chunk of code that I'm going to call target. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a group for the targets. I'm going to call this target group. And it's going to be sprite pygame.sprite.Group. And now we need a for loop to add all the targets. So I'm going to call this for target in range. Let's give it 20 targets. Seems fine. And for each of these, we want to create a new target in a random position. And to do that, we first need to import the random module. Otherwise, we couldn't get random numbers. And all I want to do now is I create a new target that is going to be created with target. I called it target. Yeah. Target. And the sprite for it, it's called target.png. And now we need to give it random X and Y positions that are between 0 and this for the width, and 0 and this for the height. And for that, I'm going to use the rand range function. So random.rand range, and goes from 0 to screen width. That's the X position. And then again, random.rand range goes from 0 to screen height. So in this for loop, every for loop, we create a new target and we put it in a random position on the screen. And once that's done, we're going to add it to the target group. New target. And after this thing has run, we have a target group that has 20 different targets inside of it. And all we need to do now is to draw this entire thing. And I am going to draw it below the crosshair group, and you're going to see in a second why that's important. Target group.draw, also on the screen. And let's run this. Let's hope I didn't make a mistake. And yeah, looks good. We can't do anything to the targets just yet, but we have some targets on the screen. They overlap quite a bit, and this is something you could be working on yourself later on. But by itself, I'm not too concerned about it. But the one thing that you want to be aware of, that drawing this group should be below this group, or let's say above. Because Pygame draws them as it can see in the code. So it draws this one first and then this one on top of it. If we move this around and hit the game now, the crosshair would be below the targets, which would be really weird. So just be aware the order of the code where you draw them really matters. So let me return all of this. And now this should be working again. So we are almost done. The one thing missing is that we need to destroy a target once we have clicked on it. And here is another really useful part of Pygame sprites. That when we have, where did I put them? This group, target group, and the crosshair group. we can very easily influence when we want to remove single sprites from these groups. And we can do all of this in our shoot method. And the method we need is called pygame.sprite.Spritecollide. And what this method is doing is it checks one sprite and a group of sprites. And if the two overlap, it can do certain things with it. The one thing that's relevant for us is that when they overlap, the method can remove one sprite from the group where the overlap happens. And yeah, so let's implement it. The one we are looking for is crosshair. So that's the sprite we're observing. Then we need a group of sprites, and this in our case is target group. And next up, we need the boolean true. So all it is saying is that when this crosshair overlaps with this group, is it going to remove whatever sprite it is overlapping with. So when this is true, whatever this crosshair is overlapping with the sprite in the target group is going to destroy this sprite in the target group. And by itself, this one should be working now. So let's hope it works. And it didn't work, and the only reason is because I can't spell. So true shouldn't be all capitalized, just the first letter is capitalized. Let's try this again now. And there we go. Now they are disappearing. And we still hear the sound. And that's basically it. And I think you can start to get a sense of why sprites are really useful. If I minimize these classes, that we have very clean code and it's very easy to follow. That here we have crosshair, here we have target, and they are self-contained classes that do their own thing. But outside of that, we just need to create the object itself, put it in a group, same thing for this one. And then in our game loop, we just draw and update them. And that's all we need. So by itself, this makes your code much cleaner and much easier to work with. And also allows you to just update stuff in here very easily without changing the code outside of it too much. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you around.